TJ Klune is the New York Times bestselling author of numerous fantasy and LGBTQIA+ romance novels, including Wolf Song, The House in the Cerulean Sea, and In the Lives of Puppets. We know that TJ Klune has legions of fans worldwide and is a Library Reads Hall of Fame author. His latest book, the reissued standalone The Bones Beneath My Skin, was just released February 4th. We are so excited to welcome TJ Klune to the first 50 pages.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. So, who or what sparked your love of stories, and when did you know that you were going to be an author?
I knew that I was going to be an author, or at least that I wanted to be an author from a very, very early age. I grew up in the 80s and 90s in rural Oregon, and books were my safety net. They were my life. They were everything wonderful about the world. I loved to read as much as I could. I read anything I could get my hands on. Unfortunately, I lived in a home that was not conducive to having a kid be like that. I got made fun of by my mother and stepfather for my love of reading. I got made fun of for my love of writing. And it was something that I learned early on, as with many things, that something that brought me joy was something that could be taken away. So I fostered this love pretty much in secret. I was that kid, the stereotypical kid that you sometimes see in movies where they're up way too late reading under a blanket with a flashlight. That was me, because that was the only time that I could have that for myself. It wasn't until I got to seventh grade that two women, my English teachers, Mrs. Benson, Mrs. Pfeiffer, changed my life. They were the first people to tell me I was good at something, and that happened to be writing. And in my very last class with them, they told me that one day that they would see my name on a book in a bookstore. I am here today, proof positive over the power that teachers can have over their students. I would not be here without Mrs. Benson, Mrs. Pfeiffer believing in me, because again, they were the first people to ever believe that that ever told me I was good at something. And they were older when I had them, and they have since passed. But when I was growing up, the thing that I did the most, the thing that essentially saved my life, was the Douglas County Library. It was where I would go every day during the summer. Again, being stereotypical, I rode my bike 5 miles into town just so I could go to the library and spend all day there during the summers. My librarian was the first person I came out to at the age of 16. She was the first person to give me books with gay people in them. And it fostered that need for me to want to be able to write, to be able to do something. I don't have a college education. I'm not one of those fancy people who went and got an MFA. I have a semester of community college under my belt, but I had a desire to do what I loved most, and that was to write. And so in my 20s, as one does, I decided I was going to write the great American novel for my first book. And it was not. It was very much a first book, but it was published by an independent publisher and did pretty well. And I guess the rest is history. I've been doing it ever since.
What a fantastic story. Like, I know, Kelsey and I are librarians, right? That is what we
Yeah.
do. And, I think it just gives us pause to think about those kids coming into the
Mm-hmm.
library all the time because, you don't know what their lives are like at home. You just know that they love books and they love reading. And what a
Yeah,
great.
and it's heartening to hear that. I've met so many young people across the world who love books as much as I did, or even more. And I can't wait to see what those people become because of their love of books.
Let's talk about, and if I can quote you, that
Okay.
there is nothing more powerful than being able to see yourself in a book. So let's talk about that power. What does it mean to you to be able to see yourself in a book?
Well, again, I didn't get to for a very long time. It was something where I knew I was queer by the age of 10. I may not have known exactly what that meant, but I knew that I wasn't like other people in my life. While most of my friends who were all boys were starting to talk about girls, it was never something that was interesting to me. So there was always this sense of otherness that I had, because when you're a kid, that otherness, the things that make you different are the things that set you apart and are the things that could potentially put a target on your back. And at the same time, I was also uh, dealing with undiagnosed ADHD. My parents refused to take me to go get tested, and I had to go do that when I was 18. So you have to imagine this slightly effeminate queer kid in rural Oregon who never shut up and never could sit still, could never sit down and sit through a class the entire way. It intensified that feeling of otherness. And when you got to read books that actually had gay people in them, keeping in mind this was the 80s and 90s. So if there were books written by gay people, chances are they would be AIDS, HIV fiction or nonfiction, because that is what the community was going through at the time. Or if it was not HIV or AIDS fiction or nonfiction, and if there were gay or queer people in books, they were there to teach the straight characters a very valuable lesson by getting sick, by getting hurt, by getting killed. We never got to have the same sort of ending that the heterosexual characters got to have. In fact, the first book that I mentioned that I was given by my librarian was a book called The Front Runner by Patricia Nell Warren. If you don't know The Front Runner, that was the first, considered the first critically and commercially successful gay novel. It was written in the 70s by a straight white woman named Patricia Nell Warren. And in this book, the book is about a man named Harlan who is a collegiate coach and a runner that he's training for the Olympics named Billy. The book is about their love story, about how they fall in love with each other, come together. And then, sorry to spoil a 50-year-old book, but the very end of the book is Billy running in his heat in the Olympics, and he gets assassinated from the stands, shot in the head, and he
Oh,
dies.
wow.
That's the end of the book. So you can imagine the first book you get with gay people in them, about gay people acting like gay people, and keeping in mind this was pre-HIV AIDS when this book was written. So it was very grounded. It was very I don't want to say erotic, but it was very sensual. And but it ended like it did. And that set me on a path, a very specific path. I knew that even at the age of 16, that if I was going to be a writer, if I was going to publish books, I would never publish a book where the queer people suffered just for the story or on the behalf of straight characters. If I was going to write and if I was going to put queerness front and center, I needed to make sure that my queer people got to have the ending that they deserved. While the road may be rocky to get to that ending, they will get the same ending that has been afforded to so many other straight characters that we never got to see. And I'd like to think I stuck to that, because I know how important it is. Even now in the year 2025, as you mentioned, there are kids that will come into libraries that are questioning themselves and they don't know where else to turn. There are kids who live in rural areas in 2025 that don't have access to the same type of things that other kids in bigger areas might. And so if a kid finds one of my books and they can latch onto that and say, this is what I want to be, this is what I want to do, this is how I see myself, then I've done my job. I've done what I set out to do, and that's the most important thing.
One of, the laws of library science, if you've done any looking into this ever, the second law of library science, every reader, his or her book. And that means that librarians serve a wide collection of patrons and acquire literature to fit a vast collection of needs. We don't judge what specific patrons choose to read. Everyone has different tastes and differences, and we should respect that. And right now, and this is a kind of an ongoing conversation, that we are having as librarians, and increasingly, unfortunately, in our own state, there's this idea that every book should appeal to only one kind of person. So it is, I think it's refreshing that we have authors who are, writing those truths, that are putting
Right.
those
And I
stories
will tell
there.
you, I write for anybody who wants to read one of my books, but I always write with my queer audience front and center in my mind. That being said, I can't tell you how many messages I've received over the years of people writing into me saying, hey, I am not your I'm sure I'm not your intended audience. I am 50 years old. I'm a straight white male. Or I'm not your intended readership. I'm in my 70s and I am a straight woman. I get so many of those messages, and I always respond to them saying, this book is for anyone who wants to pick it up. Yeah, you're not queer, and you may not necessarily always understand what it means to be a queer person, but picking up a book like that gives you the chance to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, at least for a little bit. And if you can walk away, not necessarily understanding that completely, but having a new kind of empathy for it, then that is wonderful. You don't need to be gay or straight to pick up a book. It doesn't matter if the book is about gay or straight characters. If you want to pick up a book, read it, do it. I had a gentleman come to one of my events last year with a copy of my book, In the Lives of Puppets. He was a straight guy, and he told me that his daughter had given him that book to help him understand her asexuality. And
Wow.
it helped
Yeah.
because he didn't quite understand what his daughter was going through. But after reading that book, after getting it from his daughter and reading about an asexual character, he said it helped him have a new understanding and helped to better his relationship with his daughter. And that isn't that what we want?
Yeah.
If you're not entertaining, books should always be entertainment. They should be entertaining. They should teach you something, yes, but my books that I write should also be entertaining. But if you can walk away from that entertainment thinking, wow, I have a different mindset, or this helped teach me something, isn't that great? Isn't that wonderful that the power of books can do something like that?
I just want to clap for a minute. Maybe we can add some like real applause
Yeah.
sound effects. In there.
Mark's made some crazy sound effects for us before. So.
Right.
So, with your latest book, The Bones Beneath My Skin, is sort of a little break from the cozy fantasy style that you've become known for in your previous series and standalone books, leaning a little bit more towards science fiction. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your latest book?
Yeah, The Bones Beneath My Skin is follows a man named Nate. It is set in the mid 1990s. As the book opens, Nate is about as low as a person can get. He has lost his job as a journalist in DC due to some unethical practices on his part. His family his mother and father are dead due to an act of violence, and Nate and his only remaining surviving family member, his brother wants nothing to do with him. So Nate, with nothing left, goes to his family's mountain cabin in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. He's expecting it to be empty when he gets there so he can recoup, refresh, figure out what his next steps are. But when he gets there, he finds that the cabin is not empty. Inside is a man with a gun who calls himself Alex, and with Alex is a little girl who calls herself Artemis Darth Vader. And the book then opens up into this wild adventure where Nate has to decide whether to believe what Alex and Artemis are telling him, or to let himself drown in his misery, that his the lowest point of his life. And it's this, to me, it's a beautiful story about not just these big, huge, cosmic things that are happening, but it is this beautiful story about three disparate people who are from separate puzzles, yet when they come together, their pieces fit. It may not form the same picture that the three separate puzzles had, but it forms a new picture. And this book could not exist without Alex, without Nate, and without Artemis. All three are main characters, and all three share basically the same amount of page time. This book could not exist with only two of them.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, kind of those different levels of connection that you create between them at different moments, whether, it's Nate being sarcastic towards Alex, or, Art quoting from the never-ending pile of Westerns that she reads, just kind of having those little moments.
Those Louis L'Amour popcorn books.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
And I let you use the phrase wild adventure, and I think that is really what it feels like. And I loved best-selling author Jennifer Armentrout's blurb review of your book. If I'm just going to quote her, she says, "Are we going on an adventure? Yes we are. This is the sci-fi romance adventure you never knew you needed. It is genre bending elements of, some different things in the story. But where did the inspiration for the story come from?
So, so this book was originally an idea I had in 2015, and it was going to be something very different. I wanted to put my own spin on a certain kind of story. I don't want to necessarily call it a trope because I think it's bigger than that, but a certain kind of story. So let me give you an example. Even though I didn't want to write, I wasn't going to make it horror. One of the big inspirations that I wanted to use was Stephen King's It, not about the clown, not about the horror, but about this idea of a group of young people in an adult novel having to come together to do something.
Mm-hmm.
That was the basis, where my starting off point. So then as I thought about it more and more, I started to develop this idea. Okay, what if we had this group of teenage boys, and what if this girl came to their town, new girl, and she had these weird powers, and the whole idea was to protect them. Wouldn't you know, in 2016 a little show called Stranger Things came out, and I was like, mother what is this? How did that happen? And so I was like, well, it
Yeah.
has it does. So like that happens every now and then. For example, I had this idea that would eventually become Under the Whispering Door, my novel about death and grief. But before I got to that point to writing that story, my jumping off point was a very specific scene in the movie Beetlejuice, where Gina Davis and Alec Baldwin essentially go to the afterlife, and it's this office space bureaucracy, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They go in and they have to fill out all these papers. So I thought, what if I expanded on that? What if like I had this thing where the afterlife was basically a bureaucratic nightmare full of red tape, and there was, like, I don't know, like a point system assigned to how good or bad you were. And then what happened the next year? The Good Place came out and did the exact same thing that I was thinking of doing, and I was like, mother it happens. So going back to Bones, when Stranger Things came out, I was like, well, there goes my idea. So I sat back and just put it in the back of my mind. I knew that maybe something would come of it, maybe it wouldn't. But then I came across a name that I had not heard in years. And that name was a man called Marshall Applewhite. If you are of a certain generation, that name might ring a bell. If it does, but you don't know quite where to put it, it's because Marshall Applewhite was a cult leader for a group called Heaven's Gate. In the late 90s, a comet was discovered called Hale-Bopp. Marshall Applewhite and Heaven's Gate believed that there was an alien spacecraft in the tail of this comet, and that when the comet passed by Earth, he and his followers would ascend into the spacecraft and leave the Earth behind. Even now, today, you can go online to YouTube and look up all of Marshall Applewhite's videos. He was constantly recording himself talking about his beliefs, what he believed would happen after they left, the state of the world. Marshall Applewhite is a very charismatic figure, as cult leaders tend to be. He's very strange looking too. He has very leathery tan skin. He's bald, his ears stick out, and he has the most inhuman eyes I have ever seen on a person. What happened to this cult? They died by mass suicide. The indelible images that many people of this generation will remember as of them in a bunker of sorts, in bunk beds, all wearing the same track shoots and white Nike shoes with cloth draped over them so you can't see them really.
Yeah.
And they all died. And it was akin to something, say, like Jim Jones in Jonestown or David Koresh in Waco. These people believed so much that something was going to happen that they were willing to give up their friends, their family, their jobs, their lives, their finances, all to follow this one person. And that kicked off this research binge on my end, not because I was thinking about it for the book necessarily, but I was very interested in the psychology behind cults. Why is it that one person, one charismatic person, why can they impose their will on people, and to the point where they obliterate that person's free will? They obliterate that person's choices to the point where they follow them. If you want a more recent example, think of QAnon
Yeah.
with that propped up online during the first Trump administration. That is a cult. It's fascinating to me, these figureheads that are put up in front of everybody, and that everything they say we are supposed to blindly follow and believe and hope, and many people do. And I'm fascinated by that, how that happens. And when I realized that portion of it, that Hale Bop angle of it, I thought back to that story I'd been thinking of with kids, and wondered, what if I kept the girl? What if I kept the girl as she was, but I went in a different direction? What if I aged up the people around her, and instead of making it a group of kids having to fight some big thing, what if I made it to where it was basically a sad dad story? We know sad dad stories because they're very prevalent. If you want a more recent example, look at, say, the HBO show The Last of Us is a sad dad story.
Yeah.
So I wanted to be able to do that with this, and give these characters, uh, basically put them in a queer action movie, because we never get to see queer people in action movies. Imagine if Bruce Willis at the end of Die Hard was like, and there's my husband. It would have been such a better movie. Gays make movies so much better. And gay people, we run faster than straight people do, so we can run away from helicopters and explosions just as well, if not better, than straight people can. And so that's how the book came to be.
So when you decided on Artemis Darth Vader, and you started with that character, was she? How did that character evolve for you? Was she always the kind of followed the structure you planned for her, or as you were writing the book, did her character change and evolve in ways you didn't expect?
I think so, because going into this book, I knew that, not to, I'll be as spoiler free as I can,
Sure.
but I knew that going into it, that Artemis was not just what she appeared to be. In appearance, at first blush, Artemis is a 10-year-old girl. And when you're writing children, you have to be very careful that you don't fall into the trap of making them too precocious,
Yeah.
meaning you don't want them to sound like little adults every time they open their mouth.
Yeah.
I've fallen victim to that before. I will admit I've done that before. But with this book, I wanted to actually have the mind of a child, even if necessarily that wasn't the mind of a human child. I wanted to have the mind of a child, because think about it. If you were plucked from your world, the world that you know, this earth, and plopped down into an alien world, wouldn't you be curious about everything? What is that? What is that? What is that? What is that flower? What is that deer-like creature? What is this flora? What is this fauna? You would question everything. And what do kids do? They never stop asking questions. Their
Yeah.
curiosity is how they learn about the world. So Artemis, as she developed in this character, I realized that I wanted to make this little girl, who wasn't necessarily a little girl at all, have the curiosity of a child, because she is not necessarily from here. So she is exploring and wondering about all these things. She finds, Louis L'Amour Westerns. She finds bacon. She finds ways to freak Nate out just by saying a few words. It's curiosity. She's exploring. She's testing boundaries and butting up against them to see if they can bend or break. And that's what kids do. And I love that about them. In fact, I wrote this book, and then immediately the book I wrote after this was The House in the Cerulean Sea. Artemis,
Oh, wow.
in a way, is a precursor for who the kids on the island would be. I often think about what would happen if Artemis met somebody like, say, Lucy, the Antichrist. How would that go?
I do have to say, I did love Artemis's obsession with bacon. I was
Yeah.
like, that's
I
fair.
did too.
I feel like,
We can
doesn't everybody
relate.
go through that
Yeah.
when they first try bacon?
Well,
You're just
yeah, and the
Or-
fact that so many different kinds of meat can come from the same animal. What is this?
because kids think about that stuff. Adults,
I know
we
they
don't
do.
think
They do,
about
and they ask
where stuff
questions,
comes
and
from or why or.
right. And some of the questions they may ask could be really out of pocket, but that's a kid because they don't have a filter.
Found found family is a theme that is often explored in your books, including The Bones Beneath My Skin. Why is this something that you come back to time and time again?
I thank you for asking this question. I really appreciate it. It gives me the chance to say that if you spend any amount of time online, you'll see that marketing is now, look, this book has found family.
Yeah.
One of those little graphs with the
Mm-hmm.
little arrow that points down to the book cover and it says found family in funny stylized letters. It's a trope.
Mm-hmm.
People have, it's been tropified. But what I need people to understand is that found family comes from a very real place. That comes from queer people. So many of us did not get to have the love and support in our childhood that we should have had. And what did that make us do? It could either destroy us or make us realize that there are other people out there who could appreciate us for who we are. Family, my family is not just made up of people who are related to me. I have my sister, my brother, and my nephew. Everybody else in my family is not related to us by blood. And that's because we had to go out and make our own family. We had to go out and find people who didn't think lesser of us because we weren't like everybody else. I'm the only queer person in my immediate family in terms of my brother and my sister, but they are just as estranged from our mother and stepfather because of the fact they saw how I was treated. They saw the anger and the vitriol that was pointed in my direction, and they received some of it too, just not to the extent that I did. And my sister and brother grew up realizing that that's not how family treats each other. And I can't say that I was the sole reason that they cut off those. They had their own issues and things with our mother and stepfather, but we went out into the world and made our own families. Which, I was just at Emerald City Comic Con over last weekend, and I got to meet so many amazing people at these shows. But at the shows that I did, at the panels that I did, you could visibly see queer people relaxing in the audience when we were talking about queerness and family and hope and joy. Because now in 2025, so many of us are terrified of what the future could hold. And not just, I'm relatively safe. I'm a cis white gay, but there are trans people who are getting attacked every single day and being told that they are not normal, being told that they are somehow lesser than everybody else because they are trans. So when we get to come together in a community like setting and talk about queer joy, queer happiness, queer revenge, we are getting that moment just to breathe just for a little bit. And that in a way is like family, because we are talking about things that are important to us, but also remembering to laugh and to be happy, because what everybody wants is to steal our joy, and we should never let them have it.
And I think there is, you know, power and hope in having that community.
There
Yeah.
absolutely is, because in 2025, when it seems like the world is on fire, when you get to have at least an hour, that's how long these panels lasted, when you get to have an hour when you're surrounded by people who think like you, who are like you, who may be queer like you, maybe neurodivergent like you, it it it's like you get to have a little reprieve before you have to go back out into the real world and face all the darkness that we have. But when you walk out back into the real world, you're carrying a little piece of light with you that you may not have had before.
So, your books can provide a form of escapism, but they also really do reflect the reality of our human emotions. And grief plays a significant role in this story. And, grief is such a universal experience. At some point, we all grieve loss. And you bring this into the
Mhm.
story in such a really touching way. And to quote the book, we are all dust and stars. What has your life experience taught you about grief and then, in turn, living?
So in 2012, I met a man named Eric. He was a writer. He wrote many wonderful books. We often joked that he was the better writer, even though I was the bigger seller. Infinitely the better writer than I could ever hope to be. In 2013, I asked him to marry me. He said yes. 6 weeks later, he collapsed in our home in Virginia. As it turned out, he had what's known as God, I'm going to mispronounce this. I always mispronounce it. Calcified hemangioma, which is another way of saying a non-cancerous tumor. But in this case, the tumor was growing on his brainstem, one of the absolute worst places a tumor can be in the human body. He collapsed in our home. By the time I got to the hospital an hour away in Richmond, he had already been intubated and was medicated up to the gills. We were told a couple of weeks later that the only way Eric would survive is if they did surgery on one of the most difficult places to do surgery. Your brainstem is essentially the conduit for the body and the brain. Everything that your brain sends out to the body, all the chemical signals, all the electrical signals, all of that goes through the brainstem. In addition, in the brainstem, there's something called the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve is what allows us to breathe involuntarily. That's what the brain sends to the lungs to help us to breathe. We don't think about it because we don't need it to think about it. It's something that we involuntarily do. We were told again that Eric would need this surgery or he would die. So we left it up to Eric, and Eric decided that he wanted the surgery. He went into the surgery, and unfortunately, they got the tumor out, but unfortunately, the brainstem was severed. And that meant the phrenic nerve was severed. And that meant that Eric was paralyzed from the neck down and would be for the rest of his life. Now, when you are a quadriplegic or a paraplegic, chances are you can't breathe on your own. And in this case, Eric would not have been able to breathe on his own since the phrenic nerve had been damaged. And once that is damaged, it cannot be repaired. So what happens to most people who are in that situation? They are ventilator dependent, meaning they have to be on ventilator support, which is a trachea tube that goes through a hole in your throat and a tube that goes down into your lungs. Now, what happened to Eric 3 years later is what pretty much happens to everybody in his position. No matter what you do, no matter how much you try to keep an open wound clean, bacteria will still get inside. Eric ended up passing in 2016 from pneumonia, which is how many, many people with quadriplegia end up passing away. And I went into this horrifically toxic place. For the past 3 years, from 2013 to 2016, I was running on survival. I was running on hope, however faint it may have been. So when eventually Eric passed, I went into a spiral of grief because it felt in a way like I had been in a holding pattern for 3 years, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And when it dropped, I finally allowed myself to grieve. But in that grief, I found anger and toxicity. I hated him. I hated our friends. I hated our families. I hated everybody who was going back in their lives as if nothing had happened, as if my life hadn't been razed to the ground. Grief is inherently selfish. It's supposed to be. It's about something that happened to us. It's about how something made us feel. But when you wallow in it too much, that grief can turn toxic, which is what it did for me. And it led to some pretty serious issues. It led to a lot of, to be quite frank, it led to suicidal ideation. It led to me not doing anything. It led to me being a zombie for a long time. Eventually, I was forced to pick myself up by some very, very strongly worded things from friends and family. And I went to therapy and I managed to put myself upright again, not in the way that I had been before, but in a way that was recognizably human. And that set me on the path that became Under the Whispering Door because, as you mentioned, grief is something that everybody goes through. If you live long enough to know what love is, you will know loss at some point. But if that's the case, then why do no two people grieve the same way? Grief is unique, even though it's universal. So I set out to write Under the Whispering Door to find out why grief does the way it does. Why do we all experience it, but no two people experience it the same way? Now, obviously, in my hubris and in my grief, I thought I would get those answers. I did not. But by the time I finished, I felt better. I can't say, I obviously will never say that I was fixed, but I
Yeah.
felt a sense of lightness that I hadn't felt in a very long time. And it brought forth this idea of grief in that it is taboo. We don't like to talk about grief. It is, in a way, it is almost taboo in the way that sex and money is. Grief, though, we don't like to talk about it because it makes us sad.
Yeah.
Obviously, it makes us hurt. But grief, again, is something that everyone goes through. So the more we talk about it, the less mystique it has. Writing Under the Whispering Door, and then again, but before that, The Bones Beneath My Skin, it helped me to recontextualize my thoughts on death. I'm not scared of death anymore. Death is something that happens to everyone. We are all going to die one day. It's the fact, it's the truth, it's what happens. So, why should we try to hide from that? Why shouldn't we talk about it more? Since, again, it's something that happens to everyone, like grief does. So it's this whole mishmash of ideas and thoughts in my head about the nature of humanity, but also my own personal grief, where the best way I know how to get through something is to try to write through it. Does it always work? No. But in this case, it did help give me a sense of perspective that I did not have before.
Wow. I don't even know how like to follow up with, to like have a response. I'm just like trying to take it all in because I think.
But it does come through in the writing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that is what attracts people to your stories too, because there is such humanity
Mm-hmm.
in that.
And I think that's something that we've lost in the past, I don't know, 10 years.
Yeah.
Like, look, I'm not going to, I'm not, I can't say that. I was about to say I'm not trying to make this political, but look, my entire life is political talking point for so many people on the other side of the aisle. So why can't I talk about that?
Yeah.
Look, it's eight. I don't, I think in the past 8 years, ever since I guess we could even go back to 2015 when Trump announced he was running for president, something fractured in this country. Either it was something that was always there and bubbling under the surface, and certain people just widened the divisions, or it was something that burst through. And I think COVID in 2020 further solidified that breaking. And I don't know that we've recovered from that in any way. And I wonder what that would look like, what kind of recovery would look like, or if we're just all going to continue to spiral down into madness, which is what it feels like it
Yeah.
goes on every day. I just I think that regardless of who you are as a person, I would like to think that most people understand empathy and that understand hope, but sometimes they get too mired down in their anger and their vitriol or in their fear of what they don't understand, and it turns into something darker. I don't know what happened. I don't know what was the tipping point, the turning point of the last 8 years, but it has been it seems like one thing after another where everything just seems to be getting a little bit worse.
Well, we know that readers have empathy.
Yes.
Yes,
So I say,
absolutely.
read more books, people.
Yes. Just read more.
Please do. Please
Read
do,
more,
because
read
it
widely.
shows. It's shown in studies that reading does make you more empathetic. Reading makes you more worldly. Reading makes you understand people better because you are reading about things that you may not ever experience in your life, but for that moment you are experiencing it, and it could help you understand the world just a little bit better. I don't think there's a I think that there is a correlation between those who choose not to read and their levels of empathy and intelligence and many other things. I think if there was a study done, that it would show that the people who do not read lack something that readers do have.
And I think that so you did, I loved your National Book Festival interview that you did with the Library of Congress. So if anybody gets a
Oh, that
chance
was
to
so
watch
cool.
that,
That was
Jen's
one of
been
the
recommending it to
coolest
everybody.
moments of my
I
life.
was like, that was such a good hour of my time.
Being invited by the National Archivist of the United States to speak on the National Mall, that was crazy. That was one of the coolest things that's ever happened to me.
And I think one thing that you said in there, like helping the reader explore their own feelings through characters that you've created. And I think that is also what reading does. It helps us explore our own feelings in a very safe way. And it might make us uncomfortable. Like we might have to deal with some uncomfortable feelings, but it gives you
Well,
that
yeah,
opportunity to do that.
and I can give you a very specific example of that. So after Under the Whispering Door came out, I didn't really know what to expect. It was a very personal story for me, probably the hardest thing I've ever had to write. But when it came out, and still to this day, almost 4 years later, a very strange thing happened. I began to receive message after message after message of people sharing their own stories of grief, their own tales of loss and pain and suffering. And for a long time, I wondered why. Why were people feeling like they could share that with me? And then I realized that it is so much easier to tell a stranger something hard than it is to tell someone you love. These people
Yeah.
don't know me aside from my books. I am technically a stranger to them, but they can know me through my writing and through what I went through. And I was very open and honest about why I wrote Under the Whispering Door. And I think people saw that, or they read Under the Whispering Door and realized that I understood. And so rather than maybe telling somebody they're close to, they told me, a veritable stranger, their stories of grief. In a way, I liken it to going to therapy, even though I'm not qualified anywhere near enough to be a therapist. But when you go to therapy, you go there because that person isn't going to judge you. You tell them the hard things that maybe you can't tell people in your life because you don't know what their reaction is going to be and you're worried about that. So when I got to be essentially the secret keeper for all these different kinds of stories of loss and pain and hope. And it has been remarkably humbling because it just goes to show again, this kind of thing happens to everybody at some point in their lives.
So,
Yeah.
since we're still on the train of books and the impact and the empathy that reading can have on us, do you get to spend much time reading for your own pleasure now that you've found
Oh, yes.
success?
I try to read every single day. I
Perfect.
I've spoken with authors before who tell me they don't have time for reading, and I want to tell them, you don't have time to write then.
Yeah.
Reading
Yeah.
is not only, it's like, when you go into a job and you want to get into a higher role, but you are not qualified for that role quite yet. So you go through like continuing education until you're qualified for that role. And maybe once you get that role, you're looking at the next role you could get. So you have to continue educating yourself for that. Reading and writing is the same exact thing. When you read as a writer, you learn how other writers do things. You learn what tricks and tips that they have. You learn how certain story arcs can sound. You learn how dialogue should sound. If you don't have time for reading, you do not have time to be a writer. Reading is so fundamentally necessary to this craft that without it, I don't know how you could do it. And reading is something that I am constantly doing. As of late, I haven't had as much time to read longer novels. So I have been reading short novels and a bunch of short story collections because A, I can finish those with the time that I have, but B, I'm also learning how to do new things because I write very long books. And writing short stories is so much harder than it is writing a novel. So I'm trying to learn how to become a better writer by reading short fiction to see how they do it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
The book I'm reading right now, by the way, is freaking amazing.
Well,
And
you
I'm trying to
just
recommend this to
yeah.
everybody who
How did you know
who
what our
who
next question would be, right?
oh
You read our
because
minds.
you're librarian. You're librarian. Of course you want to know what people are reading.
Yes, of
The
course.
book it's new. It's a novella, or I should say a shorter novel. It's at 195 pages in my e-reader. It's called Victorian Psycho
Oh,
by Virginia Fato.
okay.
It is, holy crap. It is so good. It is a Victorian set novel that follows a woman who is who is hired to be a governess of sorts, but she is psychotic. She is
Hmm.
having a breakdown and she is apparently going to do something pretty bad to this family. I'm like, this family is filled, the mother and father of this family is filled, are not very nice people. The children are little little gremlins. And it's fascinating to watch because, Victorian Psycho brings to mind Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho,
Sure.
which is an obvious inspiration. It's just that this novel features a woman set in Victorian times, and it is fascinating. I rarely get jealous of other writers the way that they write, but Virginia Fato, I have never read her before, but I am seething with jealousy about how well written this is. It is remarkable.
Well, we're going to go check
Yep.
that out
Mhm.
now. Put it on our to
Yes.
be read list for sure. We have really, really enjoyed our conversation with you today, TJ. Thank you so much for joining us on the first 50 pages. And if you're looking for more from TJ Klune, you can visit his website, tjklunebooks.com, connect with him on Instagram and Goodreads, and of course, you can find his books at your local library.